heard of me before? How many have heard of Paul? I think I won that contest. Come back to try to put my life and my book in perspective. I was so upset to discover that I had become the second-rate gospel in the New Testament. Looking through the New Testament, coming over in the airplane today from Galilee, I was somewhat chagrined to discover that Matthew came first. I'm often viewed as the gospel writer who's in second place, who has no birth stories and no endings to the gospel. And people often associate me with John Mark, who quit on the first missionary journey. And so I have a rather bad reputation, as you see. But I would like to come back this evening and address that situation, talk about my first-rate gospel, and also to center in on the story of the death of Jesus Christ, which I feel will be a very appropriate theme for this evening, and hopefully the gospel to be used this year at Easter time. I'm often viewed as in the shadow of Matthew, and the thing that stirs me most is throughout the last 100 years I've been interpreted over against Matthew or Luke or John. But I'd like to say to you that I'd like to stand on my own as the first-rate gospel. I was very happy to discover that about 100 years or so ago in Europe they finally discovered that Matthew and Luke had copied my gospel rather extensively. And so I'm here to say that I was the model for the gospel and that other people have found my gospel very helpful in telling the story of Jesus. And I would like to share with you this evening that my gospel is a story and should be discovered as a story or a narrative that can be told with a plot, also with main characters, and with theological interest running throughout. I'm very happy to say this evening that I told the story just like it was. How many of you appreciate people who tell the story just as it happened? They're blunt and honest. I do that. I don't mince any words at all from the very beginning. I start with the ministry of Jesus and his baptism. And I would suggest to you that some Christmas would be good to use my gospel for your preaching on the Christmas story for a change. Matthew has the wise men and Luke has the shepherds, but I begin with the preaching of Jesus and the gospel, and that's what Christmas is all about anyway, isn't it? Surprise the people in your church and preach on Mark one Christmas, and they might wake up there in the service and hear. They're so accustomed to hearing the Christmas stories from Matthew and Luke. I don't have a beginning, as some people have said, but I start with the ministry of Jesus. And I tell it just like it is. I'm not afraid to paint the face of Jesus in human terms and human emotions. And I really do give it to the disciples, those 12 who didn't understand the ministry of Jesus. Now, I'd like to establish right here at the beginning that I was very much under the influence of the Apostle Paul and not the Apostle Peter, as so many have said, because of one church father citation. But Paul was the one who influenced my gospel rather heavily, and the great country of Galilee in particular. People are always putting me in Rome, but as you'll discover, my gospel is the story of the countryside, and the fields, and of the lilies of the field. It's not an urban gospel at all, but one of the countryside. Following the death of Jesus on the cross, a group of us in Jerusalem came to Galilee and established a community. It was to this community that I wrote my gospel. A community of the followers of Jesus gathered around the Sea of Galilee, and Galilee is the central focus of my whole gospel. Even at the end, I direct the disciples to go to Galilee, and I will go before you, I say to the disciples. And so it's a gospel that reflects the theology of gathering Jews and Gentiles together, and telling the story just as it happened. You might compare my story to Matthew and Luke's and see how blunt that I can be in describing things. To this day, most people have never captured my language. It's never quite been translated into English, as you might suppose. Some of the words were just too strong. Remember, the disciples were out in the boat, and the storm came up, and the waters were pouring into the boat. disciples go over to wake Jesus, who was asleep, with his head on a pillow. I might point out, I always love to put in little details. And Jesus awakes from his sleep, but the disciples, in shaking him, said, Master, Master, we are perishing. Don't you care that we are perishing? I just let the disciples say it. Rather harsh tones. Don't you care that we're perishing? And in Matthew records the story as the disciples saying, we are perishing, we are perishing. But I just tell it bluntly, don't you care that we're perishing? Jesus awakens and says to the disciples, have you no faith at all? Matthew looks, will indicate, where is your faith? I just say it bluntly. Have you no faith at all? And that's the best way to understand language, to make it as blunt as you can. Jesus came up against the demons. And I use a very strong word in the Greek. He was snorting like a horse. Harsh word. Nobody's ever translated it, but it's there. When Jesus was baptized, I said the heavens were pulled apart and ripped asunder. Or at the end of my story, when the veil of the temple was torn, I don't use the word torn, that mild and meek word. I said the veil was ripped asunder, torn to pieces. I love those harsh words. One occasion, Jesus had gone out into the hills to pray, and the disciples couldn't find him. And I just indicate he went out, and the disciples went forth, and they were hunting Jesus down like a wild animal hunt, tracking Jesus. Very strong word there. And then in the temptation of Jesus, there in that harsh language, I say, and Jesus was picked up and thrown out into the desert. Matthew describes it as Jesus was being led into the desert. I say he was picked up and thrown out into the desert. How many of you like harsh language? So I want you to hear me true tonight. The gospel's been left in the shadow because of some of the harshness. In fact, I say on several occasions, Jesus got angry. Matthew and Luke leave out the word anger. Another occasion, Jesus' family arrives, and they want to take Jesus home because they think he is beside himself. Matthew and Luke left that story out completely. So I'm not afraid to show the strong human emotion of both Jesus and the disciples, and to make the language strong. My favorite word is epitomao, that is in my native Greek, which people, in translating it, has, of course, they watered it down. And Jesus rebuked the disciples. Epitomao almost means to physically censure. In fact, you could translate it to rap on the knuckles, because a favorite device among the Jewish rabbis, the student didn't recite correctly, the rabbi would rap them across the knuckles. Very good device for teaching. And so you can almost translate that word to rap on the knuckles, which I would like to translate. 9 times I use that strong word. Jesus comes up against the demons, and he raps them on the knuckles, and they come out of the individual. Even the sea is treated as a demonic kind of lake, and Jesus raps the sea on the knuckles when the waves are pounding into the boat. And even Simon Peter, in the confrontation at Caesarea Philippi, Peter epitomaos Jesus, and Jesus turns around and epitomaos Peter. Matthew and Luke never records that story. Well imagined. And so it's interesting just to follow through the epitomaos, that strong language of rebuke, or even stronger, I would say. 9 times it plays a part in my gospel. So it's a gospel of rough language, tough talking, and so far nobody has really ever translated it to capture all the flavor of my gospel, the second gospel, as you call it. As you look at the Gospel of Mark, you soon discover that it tells a story bluntly and fairly and quickly, and I love to use the present tense. 151 times I use the historical present, so everyone will think I'm telling the story right in front of them. And do you know Matthew removes all of them except 21, and Luke takes out all of them except one present tense. I have 8 Aramaic words to show the primitive nature of the sources I use. And Matthew just uses a few, and Luke takes out all the Aramaic terms. And Matthew and Luke were a little uptight about the roughness of my style and language, and they loved to polish it and make it into a smoother gospel. But I think you should just hear it as it was at the time I wrote. I have 6 mini-gospels within the gospel, you might say, and each mini-gospel has a theme. As you look at the 6 parts of my gospel, each one will stand alone if you so desire it. And in the first section, chapters 1:1 through 3:12, you encounter Jesus. He's identified through 5 confrontations with Jewish leaders and authorities. I have 13 of these controversy stories that serve as a backbone for my gospel. They build in intensity as you go on to the very last one when the authorities go out and try to plot to take Jesus' life. Controversy stories are very important. There are 5 in the beginning. And Jesus encounters Jewish officials and authorities. And through those encounters, which can be very harsh, and the language is rather harsh, Jesus is identified in a certain way. Now, as you look through the 6 mini-gospels, so to speak, there's a very important theme of geography that has meaning theologically, not just places. But throughout my gospel, the sea is the place of evil. This is where evil comes from, the sea. And the sea is always standing as a barrier zone to the ministry of Jesus. Have you ever wondered, as you've read Mark, why Jesus crosses the sea so many times? Back and forth and back and forth. The sea is the barrier zone. On the west side of the sea, you have the Jews. On the east side of the sea, you have the Gentiles. And the whole mood of the gospel is to show Jesus' great desire to cross the sea and to take the gospel to the Gentiles. Some of my Pauline influence, by the way. Everything that happens on the western side of the sea among the Jews will be duplicated in my gospel and the Gentiles on the eastern side of the lake. Thus I have 2 feedings in my gospel. Not only have the feeding of the 5,000 among the Jews, but also the feeding of the 4,000 among the Gentiles. And every time Jesus tries to cross the sea, there's a huge storm, as if to say that the sea itself is blocking the mission of Jesus. That's why Jesus epigematos the sea. He wraps it on the knuckles to get those evil spirits out. He uses the same language that he used with the demons. Shut up and get out. Harsh language, by the way, it's never translated. It's almost like saying, be muzzled. Be muzzled like a dog, he said to the demons. And so it's very important to see the high mountaintops as places of revelation from God. The sea is a place of evil in all 6 of the sections of Mark. So in this beginning section, Jesus encounters the Jewish authorities, and also he encounters the demon-possessed people for the first time. And you have these harsh encounters, and you know exactly who Jesus is at the end of that first section in 1:1 through 3:12. The second gospel is by the sea. The disciples are sent out, and the disciples come back and give their report at the end of the section, starting in 3:13, going on through 6:30. And each section, I make a gigantic sandwich type of construction. And in section 1, you have the ministry of John the Baptist, and at the end of section 1, you have the ministry of Jesus and the field and the sect. In this section of by the sea, starting in 3:13 and going through 6:30, you have the disciples being called and named. Then they're trained through parables and through wonderful miracles. And at the end of 6:30, they come back from their missionary journey and give their report. The whole section is by the sea and training and teaching disciples. And I put almost all the parables of Jesus in one section, chapter 4. Very unusual, not like the other gospel writers. And all the teachings of Jesus, and in the parables especially of seeds and growing, from small beginnings come great results, would be the teaching in that section. And so disciples are trained. I think this is a very clever way of presenting the disciples. And I present the disciples, as I said, with all of their warts and failures and shortcomings. And I think that's the way they should be presented, because I'd like for you to identify with the disciples as leaders of the church. And then in the second section, we see then the teaching of Jesus to the disciples. The third section then begins, in which we have eating and feeding as the theme. This section going on from 6 8:31 on through 8:22, you have Jesus feeding the disciples, Jesus feeding the multitudes, and eating and feeding. Those words are used over 20 times in this one section. I know as Baptists you would appreciate that, and you would enjoy it. So Jesus ministers to the people. You have the longest trip of Jesus up into the northern part of Galilee and on beyond, in which Jesus ministers to the woman who has a child who is ill, and she requests the crumbs that drop from the table. And all through the section you have the two feeding stories. At the beginning, the feeding of the 5,000. At the end, the feeding of 4,000 among the Gentiles, and everything in between, all about eating and feeding. I think that's a very clever way to set that whole section up. People never give me any credit for such brilliance of writing stuff. But a great big story of feeding 5,000, feeding 4,000, and everything in between deals with feeding. The controversy with the Jews is over eating with unclean hands. And so you go through the whole section in that fashion. The fourth section, or fourth mini-gospel, has to do then with the confrontation of Jesus on the way. I use on the way or on the road about 10 or 12 times. That little phrase keeps coming back. And at the beginning, you have the healing of a blind man. And at the end of the section, you have a healing of the blind man. Isn't that clever? And in between, the disciples are blind as bats. So 3 times on the road, Jesus first of all meets the blind man and heals him, and he sees the light. And then 3 times the disciples come to Jesus and misunderstand the nature of his gospel. Number 1 is Simon Peter himself. I don't show him as the great, bright disciple as the other gospels do. He is a leader of the 12. We have this confrontation in which we have the rebuking of Peter to Jesus. Jesus declares in 8:31 who he is. He's going to Jerusalem to die. He'll be resurrected. And Peter comes up with a wrong conclusion. The only time Jesus ever called anybody Satan, he called Simon Peter Satan, the leader of the disciples. It's very interesting to compare Matthew's account of the same story. There's no rebuking on Peter's part, and Peter gets blessed for his insight. But in my gospel, they just get rebuked. And so Peter comes with an incomplete answer and fails the test there at Caesarea Philippi. Then they're on the road again. There's my theme, going down the road. Jesus, once again in 9:31-32, tells them he must suffer and die. Looks over the disciples, they're busily talking. And Jesus wonders what great theological insights they've been talking about. He turns to the disciples and says, "What were you talking about when you were on the road?" They go sheepishly sad. "We were talking about who's the greatest in the kingdom of God." And Jesus said, "What? Who's the greatest in the kingdom of God, and who's going to be the greatest?" They get back on the road again, heading toward Jerusalem and to the summit. Blind man's already been healed. The disciples are failing the test. Once again, Jesus in 10:31 tells the disciples, "I must go to Jerusalem and die." It's the longest of the passion statements. And be crucified, be spat upon, and they'll be resurrected. He sees James and John over there discussing, and he's so happy they finally received the insight. He turns to James and John and says, "Now what were you discussing when we were on the road?" "My Lord, grant us the chief seat in your kingdom. Sit on your right hand." Jesus said, "What?" And comes out with a very strong statement of how blind the disciples have become and how darkened their eyes have become. And immediately he turns and heals another blind man, blind Bartimaeus. And again he's back on the road heading for Jerusalem. Isn't that a beautiful section of my gospel? It'd be good to preach on the Easter time with all the blind Christians we have today. I just don't mince words at all, as I've already told you. And of course, the 5th section, 11-13. And in this section, I put down the Jewish temple. I don't have much use for it. As you read my gospel in chapter 11, you have the grand procession into Jerusalem. I'm going to surprise you. You're going to try this one year at Easter time. In my gospel, there's no triumphant procession into Jerusalem. We always preach that on Palm Sunday using Matthew and Luke, as always. But in my gospel, when Jesus and the disciples get there, nobody comes out of the city. It's just strange silence. Jesus goes in and looks around. There's not a soul there. The only people who are cheering on the way into Jerusalem are the people who come with Jesus from Galilee. When you read Matthew's story, the host of Jerusalem come out of the city, greet Jesus, and yell, and so forth. In my gospel, he gets the complete silent treatment. Try that some year on Palm Sunday. The Mark story instead of Matthew and Luke, and tell it just like it is. And at the beginning of this section, maybe section 5, you have then the story of the cleansing of the temple. And then at the bottom of the section, in chapter 13, the prediction of the destruction of the temple. And I portray the Jewish temple as barren as the old fig tree, and I put those two stories together. I'm the only gospel writer to do that. So the Jerusalem temple, as I say very nicely, quoting the words of Jesus, as we stand on the Mount of Olives, you see the Temple Mount. And I record the words of Jesus. If you have faith, you can take that whole Temple Mount. If you look over your other shoulder on the Mount of Olives, you see the Dead Sea. You can throw the whole sea into the temple. And I called the disciples to go to Galilee. And you know the first thing the disciples did after the death of Jesus? Went right back to Jerusalem. Always dull and dense, those disciples. Well, my final section, one I'd like to emphasize this evening, I think it would be very nice for Easter meditation, is my famous Passion story. It's the 6th section, chapters 14 through 16. There we have the story of Jesus' death. And let me tell you, if you preach from my Easter story, the people will stand up in excitement because my story is so different from the rest. It's somber. It's dark. There's not a breath of light in that whole story. Jesus is put to death in a gruesome fashion. There's nothing to ease the tension of the story. In fact, the only words of Jesus from the cross are words of lament. Why have you forsaken me? Jesus screams it out, I say. The last words of Jesus, a scream. An audible scream, a loud voice crying out, why have you forsaken me? Jesus dies on the cross. No other words I record in my gospel. We always bring in the other words from Matthew, Luke, and John. But I paint a somber story. Really, today, I can't understand why Christians wear these crosses around their necks. It was a horrible, cruel way of killing people. It'd be like wearing a little electric chair around your neck today on the charm. It's a horrible kind of death that you can imagine. And Jesus died there on the cross, screaming out that tormented cry. And there was darkness over the whole land, and the veil of the temple was actually ripped apart into little pieces as the whole world shouted out against this terrible death of Jesus. It makes you think when you read chapters 14 through 16 of my gospel. I don't make it pretty at all. I just tell it like it is. How many appreciate that? Dare to use my gospel at Easter time. A feature of this final Passion section of my gospel are 3 wonderful sandwiches. And I'd like to explain these sandwiches to you now, because I'm the proudest of these than any other attribute of my gospel, and you have a list of them. I use a little American terminology there, maybe Canadian, in which I'm the only gospel writer to receive in my tradition stories about Jesus. And I love to split one story apart and insert another story in the middle. The other gospel writers just tell them 1, 2, 3, 4. But this is a brilliant type of writing, I must say, in a modest way. And many of the Greeks used it, by the way. So take one story, insert another story in the middle, and the outer story interprets the inner story. There are 12 of these scattered throughout my gospel. And there are 2 stories or 3 stories in almost every one of the 6 mini gospels. But in the final one, I want you to look at the last 3 stories. They're all found in the Passion narrative. And I want to show you how exciting these stories can be. And each story has a little phrase in the Greek language that holds the whole sandwich together. By the way, in the section about the temple, I take the story of Jesus cursing the fig tree, and people have often wondered about it, and insert also the story in the midst, the cleansing of the temple. This way, it makes sense. Why did Jesus curse the fig tree? People have always asked that when they read Matthew and Luke. Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem, sees the fig, does not have fruit on it, he curses it, goes into the temple, finds the temple with no fruit either, places a curse on the Jewish temple, comes back out and sees the fig tree all shriveled up. The outer story interprets the inner story, and it makes much more sense that it's a parable telling us about Jewish worship. The fact that the fig tree is all shriveled up and dead with no fruit, and when Jesus enters the temple, it's become a house of thieves, a den of thieves, and a place for prosperity, and a place of just marking time. So the sandwich is a wonderful way of holding that together. Or I take, for example, the story of the woman with the issue of blood, and also the little girl who's nearing to death. So I take the story of the little girl who's nearing to death, split it apart, insert in the middle the story of the woman with the issue of blood, and makes a double wonder story, and the number 12 holds the whole sandwich together. The little girl is 12 years of age, and the woman has had this sickness for 12 years. Isn't that brilliant to tie the stories together in such a wonderful way? So there are 12 wonderful marking sandwiches. It's such a brilliant device. I want all of you to take a pledge with me on this first night of the lecture series. Would you raise your right hand and repeat after me? Raise your right hand with me. Repeat after me. I pledge sometime in my ministry, I will preach one of the marking sandwiches. World without end, amen. I'm trying to start this new movement, get my sandwiches out into the modern world. It might surprise the people some morning to say you're going to preach from a marking sandwich. It's quite exciting. Well, look at these three marking sandwiches in the Passion narrative. Very nice, starting in chapter 14, 1 and 2. Very interesting device. You have the leaders, Jewish leaders, plotting to take the life of Jesus. At the bottom of the sandwich, 7 through 9, you have Judas joining the leaders. And in between, you have a story of a woman who comes to anoint the head of Jesus with costly oil, and I don't give her name in my gospel. And so on the outside, you have the Jewish officials plotting the death of Jesus. Judas, once a disciple, turning his back on Jesus. In the middle of the story, you have a woman's discipleship held up before the eyes of glory. And I love to stress the little people in my gospel. They never get enough emphasis. Disciples are a bit dull and dense, but the little people come through. The little old lady in the court of the women putting in her mite, and she's praised by Jesus. And you know, the only person in my gospel to understand who Jesus is, not the disciples, they never understand. It was the leader of the execution team, the Roman centurion, standing at the foot of the cross, looking up at the cross and saying, surely this is the Son of God. It's the little people that's so important. And all the wonder stories, the little people come in as a choir. And all the disciples didn't even recognize the importance of the feeding of the 5,000, the little people are there and they always chant, how marvelous, how wonderful, how marvelous, how wonderful. They're just always there on the side singing. I always appreciate the little people. You should appreciate those in your church as well. How many of you appreciate your little people? Do the little job. Well, the little people play a significant role. And here this woman, unnamed, comes in, anoints Jesus with this priceless perfume. And she's the only one to understand true discipleship. And Jesus said she was anointing him for death. She understood what was going to happen in Jerusalem. Outside, one of the 12, Judas. And every time I named him, I always add a little phrase, and he was one of the 12. He was one of the 12. I want you to know that, you see. And even at the end of the story, Jesus changed Peter's name back to Simon when they were there in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's Simon now instead of his new disciple name of Peter. The disciples failed the test, and Judas there on the outside, this unnamed woman on the inside, doing a wonderful act of discipleship. Isn't that marvelous the way I've constructed that sandwich? It would make a tremendous sermon. Well, there was Judas. Next of all, we come to old Simon Peter. Simon, a flittering dove that would flit in every direction, as I remember him. Strong words, slow in action. I construct a wonderful marking sandwich here. On the outside, you have Simon Peter's betrayal of Jesus in the sense of the fact that he denies Jesus the 3 times. On the inside, you have the Supreme Court of the Jews denying Jesus. So while the Jews determine the fate of Jesus, and the trial scene that I bring in at that point is one of my best constructions there. So many people have read it over and over again. Peter's denying Jesus on the outside, the Jewish leaders denying him on the inside. And Pilate there over the trial of Jesus in those harsh terms. Wonderful sandwich, a nice way to present that on Easter week. And the final sandwich there, sandwich dealing with women. Bless those dear women. On the outside, you have the women all wondering where they're going to put the body of Jesus. The bottom of the story, coming back to anoint the body of Jesus. On the inside of the sandwich, the story of the death, the burial of Jesus. And so it makes a wonderful way to end the story. The women were there at the cross, and the women were also there on the day of resurrection. A wonderful way to end the Easter story. So 12 wonderful Markan sandwiches that punctuate my gospel and all 6 mini-gospels as a way of bringing the gospel alive during Passion Week. You can read Matthew next year, and you can read Luke the year after that, but this year use Mark. How many of you today are convinced that I am a first-rate gospel writer? Come on. It's hard to get people to change their minds at that point. So much involved with John and others like that. The whole theme of my gospel, finally, is to say it is the cross of Jesus. It's only at the cross of Jesus that you recognize who he is. By taking up your own cross and following in the footsteps. As you read my gospel, I want you to identify with those disciples. They're dull and dense, and disciples have been that way all the way down through the Christian centuries, but there's still hope that Jesus will lead them ahead to go to Galilee. The cross is the center focus, and that is why only the centurion at the cross recognizes who Jesus is. He's standing there looking at the suffering of Jesus, and thus he could say, truly, this is the Son of God. The whole theme of my gospel is at the cross, Jews and Gentiles will be united together. It comes off so nicely with the theme of bread. Feeding of the 5,000 among the Jews, and 12 basketfuls are left over, symbolizing Judaism. 4,000 among the Gentiles, 7 baskets full left over, emphasizing 7, the number of the Gentiles, universalism of the whole world. And from that, as they're traveling back across the sea, disciples are in the boat. Now they've just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people. They've just seen Jesus feed 4,000 people. And Jesus asks them the question I want you to answer. 12 basketfuls for the Jews and 7 for the Gentiles. And Jesus said, when I fed 5,000 people, how many baskets were left over? 12. He said it louder than that. How many basketfuls were left over? 12. When I fed 4,000 Gentiles, how many baskets were left over? 7. How many were left over? 7. And the disciples were hungry coming back across the lake. And they said, Jesus, where are we going to get some bread? And Jesus said, what? There was 1 loaf of bread in the boat. I tell that very explicitly. For the Jews and the Gentiles, 1 people will come forward, symbolized in the 1 loaf of bread. The disciples didn't even recognize it. All the way through my gospel, I emphasize the messianic secret of Jesus. I always try to keep it hidden. Jesus had come into the world to try to bring Jews and Gentiles together. People didn't recognize him. There were people in my church who only wanted to see the great wonder worker, the Davidic kind of Messiah, and they didn't realize that Jesus had to suffer. So the main theme of our gospel in chapter 8 especially is to show that the true Messiah is one who will suffer and die on the cross. And the demons call out the wrong view. You're the mighty Son of God. You're coming on the clouds. And Jesus tells them to shut up. Anytime you have to shut up, that's a rather strong word. Say this is the incomplete view. If you're going to know Jesus in my gospel, you must see the cross and see his suffering. And you must take up your cross too. Now, I've come a long ways this evening on a cold night. We don't have this kind of snow in Galilee fine people just address me as Mark. I warn you, I'll be blunt and honest. And so we'd like to ask you a question this evening. Yes?
Why did you go back from Perga?
From Perga, yes. I thought people would bring up that story. Remind me a lot of James, the Lord's brother. I was a little concerned when I was on that journey that perhaps Paul was going in the wrong direction of bringing Gentiles into church. And I was just a young teenager, and so I ready to go back to Jerusalem. The worst part of the journey, 100 miles up to the mountains, was ahead. But you can't always hold that against me, can you? How many will forgive me for that? Thank you very much. In the back, yes.
Yeah, it's a privilege having Mr. Mark here tonight.
And Mark, yes.
And I thought some of the pertinent questions which have been bothering my mind will be answered from you when we get to heaven. Now you are here.
Now you can. Most people have a long list for
There
Paul.
have been controversial discussions, scholarly too, on the longer ending of your gospel.
Yes.
Tell us if you like the longer ending or it is an addition, a later addition.
Since you've invited me to Acadia to do these lectures, I will give you a special revelation tonight. Just for you, I did not do the ending of that gospel. And I ended with 16:8. That's where it should end. The women run away, are fearful. Disciples have run away. And I want to leave you with the cross before your eyes. The crucifixion before your eyes. The resurrection took place. Jesus ascended. The tomb is empty. But the important thing I want to leave you in your mind is the cross and Jesus on the cross. If you add an ending, then you lose that wonderful way of ending the gospel. You can read Matthew and Luke to get all the stories of the resurrection. But I'd like to leave you with the cross. And that's not a bad place to leave you, is it? Other questions you'd like to ask Mark? Rather old disciples. And I can use that word. Don't be everyone, yes.
A couple of questions. You've done quite a bit of name dropping. What about Barnabas? I think he'd be at the top of your list.
Barnabas was a very fine person, yes, a traveling companion of Paul. But I wish we had a little bit more note given to me in the book of Acts. Barnabas was an outstanding Christian. Who else has a question for Mark? May not get this chance for a while. Yes?
Yeah, my second question, which one of your friends wrote the book of Hebrews?
My second revelation just for you Acadia people. You'll appreciate that. Lydia wrote the book of Hebrews. That's why there was never a name put on it. If the people had seen a woman's name, they would have never read it. So I say that for all of the women. Now you're the first group to know that. Other questions? Let's get back to Galilee. Yes.
In one of the Gospels, it mentions that in the garden, Gethsemane...
You're not going to bring that story up on it.
And it then suggested that that young man was John Mark.
I'm the only one to record that story. It's sort of my signature on my gospel. Give that little personal note to it. It's also sort of symbolic of the disciples who ran away too. The same words, by the way, in my gospel are used for the young man in the tomb. Same Greek words are used. And I don't say angel, I say young man was in the tomb. So I thought that was a very interesting note to put in there as well. How did you remember that story, by the way? Final questions or to depart?
What way were you profitable to Paul?
To Paul?
The last of his life.
Yes, Paul was a wonderful teacher for me. As I say, I was much more under the influence of Paul than Simon Peter, in spite of Papias and other church fathers. Paul's theology is in my book, Using Gentiles at One. And Paul also later forgave me when he was in jail in Rome. I hope you remember that. I was his good friend to the very end. When you're young, you do make mistakes. I suppose we all think of that. Don't remember that story so much, though. How many will remember my positive points? Final questions? Yes.
You pointed out that you didn't include any nativity stories
Yes.
in your gospel.
You don't hold that against me, do you?
Not at all, but I'm curious to know why. Had you heard about it, or what?
Because of my theology of the cross, I thought the most important thing to happen was to preach the cross of Christ, start Jesus with his preaching, and I really didn't think the world was going to last long enough to talk about much anything else, and I wanted to get the gospel out to the people. I really thought the end of the age was coming quick. But do try that some year at Christmas. Preach from Mark and astound the people of the church. Also on Palm Sunday. Other questions? I'm going to ask a very important question I wouldn't dare to do, except I hope I have made my case. Hopefully someone in this great crowd of people. How many of you consider my gospel to be your favorite gospel? Raise your hand. Wonderful. I hope the number will increase. And the Gospel of Mark will become a favorite for you. I'm Mark. I've come back from the ancient world to tell you about my gospel. As you approach the Easter season, to remember the Passion story, chapters 14 through 16. Tell it through the sandwiches. And to help you understand that I brought all of my ability, all the excitement of my language, and dedicate it to God and allow him to use my life. And I am so thrilled that you folks now have 4 gospels. Never try to push them together. They're 4 unique paintings of the face of the Lord. And above all, allow my face of Christ to be seen in your world of 1998. May God bless all of you. Shalom and shalom and shalom.